So the media talks about the evangelical right, but what about the evangelical left? What is that all about? Is it on a rise before our very eyes? And how will this rise impact the Millennial Generation? In today's episode of Generational Talk, we explore all this with Reverend Stephen Knight. Join the conversation. And if you want more videos like this, subscribe to our channel.
Great to be on here with you guys. I've been looking forward to having this conversation with y'all. I am a minister in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. That's my little mainline Protestant denomination that I am a part of. Have been a commissioned minister for the last 10 years. Helped start a couple Disciples of Christ churches, but have done a lot of work in web communications and social media over the years. Grew up conservative evangelical and have found myself years later in this reclaiming the evangelical identity, but as a progressive. Mm-hmm. And so I work full time for the Reverend William Barber and his organization, Repairers of the Breach. We do a lot of work on the Poor People's Campaign, the National Call for Moral Revival. And I'll just get this out of the way now. We have a big digital mass Poor People's Assembly and Moral March on Washington coming up June 20th. Really hope, if you're not familiar with the Poor People's Campaign, check it out. poorpeoplescampaign.org, june2020.org is the website for June 20th.
I'll place a link to that in the comments.
Yeah, that'd be great. We want folks to RSVP and be online. We're hoping it'll be the largest sort of mass online assembly of poor and low wealth folks, advocates, moral leaders. I also started a nonprofit organization 10 years ago called Transform Network. We do a lot of work with progressive churches, progressive faith leaders. We just launched a new online learning platform called TransformClassroom.online, where we've got online courses happening because we're all online right now. That's basically all we can do. So that's a great resource that's available to folks, and hope folks will check that out. And to get into this conversation, I also administer a number of Facebook pages like the Christian Left, Progressive Evangelical Facebook page, and others. So I'm pretty deeply immersed in this topic and in this conversation.
I would say, Steve, that you and I definitely come from a similar background. Jesus kids. What was the nickname for us, Paul?
Jesus freaks.
Jesus freaks. Yeah, we come from that background. Did you come from that background, Dan?
Yes. Conservative, evangelical, charismatic.
Yes, and I've definitely gone more left as far as progressive Christianity is concerned. And so with that, I also want to give more context to the conversation for the viewers by going around the room. And if everybody could share their story, we'll start with you, Paul.
Okay, well, I wanted to start off just telling Steve, I'm from I'm very similar background, independent Christian churches. They actually split from the Disciples of Christ over who got communion back in the middle of the 20th century. So my mom's from the Disciples of Christ, and I'm from the Independent, which is a little more conservative version of the Disciples. Now, there are some conservative disciples, but we won't get into that too much. But I basically grew up as a youth group kid. My dad was a minister. He was actually studying to be a minister while I was a kid. So a big part of my childhood was growing up on a Bible college campus. So it would just permeate everything. So my neighbors across the street were from Thailand, and they were going to be their mom was studying to be a missionary, and it was just crazy because I was just completely immersed in that environment, and everything else seemed very strange to me even after I left Bible college. And of course, after that, I'm a minister's kid. So ministers' kids, I always say they can go two directions. They can rebel really quick and go completely the other way to prove that they're not not too cool, not too like wimpy or scared or whatever, or they can go like the other way and just be like, oh, I'll just go with this. And I went with that, and I really I was a true believer. I was the leader of the youth group. I got like camper of the week at church camps. When I went to Bible college, I was getting the highest scores on the Bible content test out of a Bible college. So I was completely immersed in it. And especially as we got into the middle of the last decade, whenever the Iraq war is going on, I started to notice like the Christian movement was becoming more and more political. Some of you might remember that it used to be pretty common for Christians to say we should not talk about politics at all in church. I barely remember that time now, but now it seems to me what's kind of led me out of, especially the independent Christian churches, is the idea that evangelical Christians are conservatives, and sometimes I see the evangelical Christian movement as a puppet of the conservative movement. And I remember, because I was a Christian service worker in China for 7 years. That's what I did after I got out of Christian college myself.
What year did you leave?
2005.
2005, and you came back when?
Huh?
And when did you come back? What year did you come back?
Oh, 2013. So
basically, the Obama became president. The world and the country pretty much dramatically changed by the time American came back.
And I left when I was like 23 or 4 and came back at 32. Like the expectations are way different, but whenever you're 32 and when you're 23. Mm-hmm. But I just noticed, like, just in the media, one time I went, because my dad was a preacher at the time, and he showed a video of what people thought of Christians. And it really bothered me because a lot of people would say, oh, the Christians are this political movement. And I didn't see Christianity as political at all, because I always kind of leaned left myself. And so I would not always go with things. Now, of course, being from there, I would get some ideas would get stuck in my head from that movement that I ended up voting Republican most of that decade. But now I'm like just noticing that it's completely turned the corner where it's almost all political. And anytime I've gone to a conservative church, that's what they talk about. They're worried about the culture influencing them, and they're standing their ground so that they don't become influenced by the culture, is how they say it a lot of times. So, but yeah, that's my journey, is that I've just kind of gotten turned off by the politicization, is that how you say it? of Christianity, of the evangelical movement.
Tommy?
So I was raised in a devoutly Catholic household, but my parents were more liberal and progressive than I was as a kid. I was very involved in the church, and I was a altar boy. I had aspirations of becoming a deacon when I got older. When I was in boot camp, I volunteered to be the prayer leader. So I was someone who, like, I would go to church sometimes 3 times during the week, and I was I was more religious than my parents were, when I probably is fair to say, when I was a kid. But they went to church every week, and my parents were both catechism teachers, and my mom worked at a Catholic school. I attended a Catholic school, so I was very, very religious growing up. As I've gotten older, I have skepticisms, but I certainly, at the very least, have a great deal of respect for Jesus as a moral philosopher, and that has not changed. I do not. I'm no longer. I would no longer consider myself a Catholic, but I would just say that I appreciate Jesus very much as a moral philosopher, and I just can't help but think that reading the criticisms that Jesus had, the Pharisees in the Bible, for example, and just wondering, like, I wonder if Jesus was here today, if he would see some parallels between the Pharisees, perhaps, and some people that are going around preaching their philosophies in his name. Yeah.
Dan?
I grew up in a very conservative Christian house. Conservative politically. I don't think we were conservative. It wasn't Mennonite or anything like that. But it was definitely full blown sort of Republican and moral stances. Raising the standard and holding it. That's always been a big part of it. And it was Christian, non-denominational, charismatic, if those words mean anything to folks, and also revivalist. Probably the clearest manifestation of the brand of Christianity that I grew up with was a stint that my family did at this event called the Brownsville Revival that happened in Pensacola. And we were deeply involved in that thing. My dad moved there to teach at the Bible school there, and I was a big part of the youth group and bass player and everything. And so, that was a very heightened, I went to the ministry school there. It was a very heightened, very specific, Christian lifestyle, that basically looked for, the sort of the advent of signs and wonders, and that the chief manifestation of the kingdom of God would be a kind of moral and spiritual revival that would, sweep the entire world. And I always probably had one pinky toe out of the philosophy of all that stuff. And basically my evolution of faith, I feel very comfortable referring to myself as a Christian, and probably in my moments of greatest transparency, I would say that, Christianity is the grand mythology within which I find most affinity for my spirituality.
That's a good way to put it. I like that. I really like that.
Dan has helped me figure out. Dan has helped me figure out a lot of descriptors for who I am. A Christian existentialist. Yes, I didn't even know that existed until we had a couple conversations on this. And
that's a term. Thank you, Ryan. That's a term I've definitely self-applied and find out that other people have done that as well. And so, politically, I think I said this on the last episode, I'm very much a grab bag of positions. There are a host of economic and social and cultural things, and I don't think any one particular camp best exemplifies what I think, but most definitely, sort of the unwinding of a lot of my conservatism had me reapproach the Bible and see stuff that I'm almost embarrassed to have been blind to, for specifically in the teachings of Christ for a long time. And I think a lot of that was just the political and sort of cultural tilt of the milieu that I grew up in. And so yes, like I said, I still am very much a Christian and have learned to not only make peace, but, quite create and find and enjoy peace in that identity. But most definitely, I think the easiest way to describe some of my movement has been a movement to the left, although that is grossly overstated. So that's basically my journey.
Darius.
If you had a scatter plot graph, that's
right. To the left. That's right. That's all drifted to the left.
And we know this is fact, but and we know this is true. I would say it's considered the left by the media and by our fellow Christians, but just saying that just kind of even bothers me. The fact that we still have to associate it with something that's political, left versus right, that just makes me want to throw up, honestly.
And it might be an interesting thing.
The politicization.
Yeah, it might be an interesting thing to consider, which is, why is it referred to as right and left? You have the grand, conservative, liberal, those big, almost Jungian, types that we can look at. But yeah, man. That's how as a shortcut, I'll just be like, yeah, I think I moved to the left in some ways. And most people kind of get it, they know that to the left means, having less rigidity around some line item things like the inerrancy of Scripture and on theological, and then economically it means like, man, I'm a little bit more regulation and redistribution is good. You know, I can find support for that in my beliefs and that sort of thing.
So my background, essentially, I started out actually going to a private, it was a private Methodist Christian school when I was in pre-K and kindergarten. And my household, it wasn't super religious, but my grandparents had a pretty strong footing in the church when they were growing up. And so I would say culturally, my family was definitely, Christian. And then as I got up through elementary school, I would still go to church with my grandparents when I would go over to stay with them on the weekends. But that just sort of slowly faded out the older I got. And so then by the time I went into college, I just had this interest in all these different religions and spiritual practices. And so for me, university was a lot of just exploring what, what made the most sense to me. And right now, I would say that I probably identify as agnostic for the most part, but same thing with Tommy. I see the tradition, and definitely obviously in the Black community or other marginalized communities, the church has played a really important role. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about definitely the social justice aspects and how even, as Dan mentioned with that left-right spectrum, I want to find out if maybe with millennials, because we see this huge drop off, if it's the religion or if it's more of the labeling, because we do know a lot of younger people aren't huge fans of, I guess, that we've said it before on a prior podcast, that they're anti-partisan, and that might apply to that left-right label as well.
I'm curious to know, did we leave the church or did the church leave us?
Oh boy.
Yeah.
What do you mean by the church? And
right.
Down we go.
Yeah, exactly.
The best word I could think of is evangelicalism, but it's probably more fundamentalist churches, and that's where I was from too. Like, I think most of us were from some sort of fundamentalist background.
Tommy, go on.
I'm like, from my experience, I mean, I didn't have any negative experiences with the Catholic Church when I was growing up, and I still, it's hard for, I have like an instinctual defensive reaction when people attack the Catholic Church, even to this day. I'm like, obviously there are some horrible things that have been done, and I even when I was devoutly Catholic, I didn't necessarily subscribe to everything, but I'm like, I can say from my personal experience, like it wasn't the fact that the church was doing things that made me feel alienated, I'm like, I'm like, one thing is I still to this day enjoy the experience of going to a Catholic mass and that feeling of like I'm connected with millions of people around the world and millions of people over the past centuries that have all experienced this similar mass experience, and I don't know, I still the church didn't do anything, the Catholic Church didn't do anything to alienate me. It was just more of becoming more skeptical of some of the claims. Yeah,
I remember like loving youth group, church camps, all these events that we did, and then whenever I got out of that environment into the regular church, like really not being totally sold on it, even as involved as I was, and how in Christianese we'd say sold out back then, was even the regular church didn't appeal to me at all. The sit in the pews and face forward, and people would always talk about like, oh, we only have 20% of our members involved. Well, your church is set up like that to where they're only 20% are going to be involved. It's a set and stare straight ahead type of situation, and only so many people can be in the front talking to that congregation. So, but yeah, and youth group was more of this like round table type of situation where everybody's involved. There might be a leader, but that's just because they might have the most charisma of the group, something like that.
Yeah, Catholic Mass certainly isn't for everybody. Yeah.
Can I just respond to some of what you guys have been sharing? Because I think, first of all, the fact that you're even asking the question, did we leave the church, or did the church leave us? I mean, that gets at a very real feeling that a lot of people have felt, and it's completely valid, that's even a question. And I appreciate the comment that was just made about, I think yes, there's been a theological piece of questioning beliefs, but there's also been just this, church has not evolved in terms of its practice in many ways. Many churches are very much stuck in a particular kind of model. I've said, churches have gotten bigger and bigger with the megachurch movement, and smaller, where you have these little mainline churches that are stuck in a very particular form of worship that's very liturgical, and it just doesn't seem relevant to most of our, lives. The churches and faith leaders, clergy, have not done a very good job of adapting to the world that we live in now. So I think both of those things are really, really
So you said faith leaders haven't done a good job to adapt, and is it generational? Do we have a lot of faith leaders that are probably from an older generation, and so they're pretty much, I hesitate to say stuck in their ways, but basically that's it. Or is this a matter of truth? Like, why should we change? This is what we believe. This is the truth.
It's probably a little bit of both, but I mean, Brian McLaren, who's a pastor and an author, talks about how institutions are inherently conservative, in the sense that you sort of get set in your ways. And I think denominations are like that. I think local churches are like that. When you have a local church that's been there for decades, and there's just like rooms full of stuff, and it's like, well, we can't get rid of that because we used that 12 years ago for the Easter pageant, or whatever. Like it's that kind of thing.
Conservative, you conserve.
You can literally conserve.
Lots of golden calves in the church building.
Absolutely. Yeah, you can't kill that golden calf. We've got
part of my Christian awakening involves a book called Pagan Christianity. I'll link that in the comments. Yeah.
That was popular like 10 years ago.
Right. And it goes through the narrative of church history, and basically how 1 minute we're okay with stained glass windows, 1 minute we're not. 1 minute we're okay with having a piano in the church, 1 minute we're not. It just goes back and forth. So you're talking about, I'm not sure who mentioned like having these idols as golden calves. I think that was you, Paul. But I think it comes down to that. There is so much outside baggage that has nothing to do with the text, the spiritual text.
Along those lines, Stephen, I'd be interested to know from your perspective how when we use the term Christian left, why that combination of words, and why not Christianity, or is it important to sort of in the current cultural context to demarcate it as separate from these ascendant more right-leaning evangelical thing? Is it a shortcut? Do you feel like it? Does that make any sense? So in the terminology, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me start by saying, I work for Reverend William Barber, who is consistent in rejecting the left-right dualism, and he often talks about that language. The history of that language comes from the French Revolution. It's not really actually relevant. And so he's done a very good job of, I think, trying to articulate and as a faith leader saying, I'm an evangelical. When the predominant and you have to, this is how even the mainstream news media has sort of latched onto. Right. Well, we need to get a faith leader to come on and talk about X or Y issue. and the default is this conservative white male evangelical voice.
Right.
And so I think the Christian left has arisen in terms of language out of a reaction to the right wing, the moral majority, the Christian right, that has been so dominant in the last 20, 30 years. And has been very successful in sort of consolidating power to the point where we have, a religious right president, essentially. And we had a religious right president in Ronald Reagan, in the 80s, going that far back.
Bush too. George W. Bush, for sure.
Yep.
I think he's about the quintessential, like, what you want as an evangelical, as a conservative evangelical as a president. So, but yeah.
I actually think that Trump is more of a fulfillment of the ethos than
that's true. I would agree with that.
Yeah, it's really hard for me, and we could, spend a lot of time talking about Trump. It's been very difficult for me to discern whether he is a true believer or if he's just using the conservative evangelical community for his own ends.
He also knows how to work the camera.
I mean, he certainly seems to be actually really into a lot of these, Robert Jeffress and Paula White and these sort of voices. Like, it seems real, at least his interest in what they have to say and, what they're saying to him. But he also probably just likes the adulation. And
it's difficult to unwind what's reciprocity and what's sincerity.
Yeah.
And what's sincere reciprocity.
Right.
Exactly.
I'd kind of like to point out something. The Christian left isn't all this new, is not a new thing. Back in the day, they called it the social gospel. Mm-hmm. And when I was in Bible college myself, they would say, the social gospel is a bad thing because they want to talk about.
You remember that word being bolded in a textbook as like a, it was a term. It's like not what we're doing.
Yeah.
I was just going to say one more thing.
Go ahead.
My first instinct was like, well, the social gospel looks like it's part of the gospel to me. And not that it's the whole thing, but that was my first thought about it. And I'd actually never went ahead and rejected it with everybody else, like this, as the social gospel is bad. Maybe that's why it ended up drifting left or whatever you want to call it.
So the quick history with that is, you're absolutely right. The social gospel movement, led by thinkers like Walter Rauschenbusch, came about at really essentially at the same time that fundamentalism, sort of in the early 1900s.
We had a presidential candidate who was big on it, right? I forget his name, Presbyterian minister.
In the social gospel movement?
I believe so, yeah.
Well, and so here's what happened, right? There were these two opposing forces before we had left-right language. It was social gospel sort of versus fundamentalism, and evangelicalism is what actually came about as sort of that third way, middle path, where you had a Billy Graham, who I worked for 6 years, who arose as sort of this moderate voice of saying, well, I'm not a fundamentalist, but I'm not a social gospel person. I'm an evangelical, and it sort of carved out this path. And that's why the evangelical community is still so sort of steeped in that, the social gospel is bad. Or they would say now social justice warrior Christians are bad. Right. But here's the in my judgment, most of the people who are making those sort of claims now are not actually evangelicals. They're actually fundamentalists. And they just don't want to own it. They just don't want to admit that. And this, I worked for Franklin Graham, and I had to leave working for the Billy Graham Association under his leadership because I was like, this guy's not an evangelical. He's a fundamentalist. And that's not who I am, So I was moving away from that. And anyway.
So since those words have been conflated, how do you distinguish them?
Evangelical and fundamentalist. I mean, you know, for me, it's there. For a while, I'll say this: I was working for an evangelical mission organization, and was forced out over my views on homosexuality. It's a long story how that even came into question. It actually started with me campaigning for Barack Obama and having an Obama sticker on my car in the parking lot, but it led to other questions about my theology, and ultimately came down to homosexuality. And of course, I landed on the wrong side of the invisible line in the sand, you know, and so I had to leave that organization. And at that point, I really felt like, you know, I'll never work in the evangelical world again. My evangelical cred is destroyed, and I can't even really call myself an evangelical. It has been people like Reverend William Barber who have helped me be able to sort of reclaim that identity, because it really is, I mean, that's who I was raised, you know, I was raised in the evangelical church. It's in so many ways, it's the culture and the language that I speak as a person of faith. You know, I've spent the last 10 years in a quote unquote mainline denomination, but you know, it's a big tent denomination, and there's a lot of people like me who bring that even more evangelical kind of ethos with us.
So you didn't grow up in Disciples?
No, I didn't.
No.
I didn't. I actually discovered the Disciples. It's funny though. I actually worked for an independent Christian church campus ministry at the University of Minnesota when I was in my early 20s. And so I knew the independent Christian church world, but they never told me about the Disciples. I never even knew the Disciples existed.
Oh,
you know, because it was like the ugly, stepchild or something.
They give communion to the wrong people.
Yeah, it's right. It's open table and you can receive communion. That's not good. So anyway, so today I call myself a progressive evangelical. I feel like I just have to put that, you know, qualifier on there to distinguish from the default of an evangelical being Franklin Graham, you know, Jerry Falwell Jr., that kind of thing.
So we see the image here with the large generation gap in American religion, and we see that with millennials, it's 49% that identify as Christian, and of course 40% that are unaffiliated, and you can see that huge generational gap there. And if you scroll down a little bit further, there's also the broad-based declines in Americans who say they are Christian. And you can see even here the declines of the share of Americans who say they're Christian. We see the biggest declines are with millennials, college graduates, and Democrats, or people leaning Democratic. And I think it's interesting that just as a feature of the millennial generation, at least the narrative right now is that social justice, racial justice, addressing institutional and structural problems. Could you talk a little bit about how that plays a role with Moral Mondays and just what you do at your ministry?
Well, first of all, let me say this about the Pew Research, and I'm glad that you brought that up. The interesting thing about this, you know, rise of the sort of unaffiliated and the so-called nuns, N-O-N-E-S, is that if you drill down in that data, what the Pew Research also shows is that the majority of the folks who call themselves now unaffiliated still believe in God, still practice prayer, have a number of these sort of markers that, going back to earlier in our conversation, is sort of like they've left affiliation, but they haven't completely left the, spirituality and the beliefs and practices that they had before. I think I forget who wrote the book, but Bowling Alone, Robert Putnam. Yeah. This idea that this is culturally something that's been happening in all kinds of different institutions and organizations over the last several decades, and we're seeing it in the church as well. And I think again it goes back to what we were talking about, how churches have not evolved and in their practices, but also in some of their beliefs, that people are like, I can't affiliate myself with this religion any longer that's not willing to question X, Y, or Z. So in the Moral Mondays movement, the moral movement that started here in North Carolina with Reverend Barber and the North Carolina NAACP when he was the state chapter president for the NAACP. We actually just yesterday had the anniversary of the seventh anniversary of the first Moral Monday. So that was just 7 years ago, but it launched this movement where thousands of people were engaged in civil disobedience at the state capitol, and it was out of what started here, people of faith, people of all religions, and people not of faith. And I think that's something that Reverend Barber, I want to just say, has been really careful and considerate about, and really intentional about saying that this moral movement, it's not just Christians or Muslims or Jews. It's not just people of faith. It is people not of faith believe that the moral arc of the universe is long and it bends towards justice, to quote Dr. King. And by saying that and always being intentional about that, he's been very inclusive. And so you have people regularly, I'm an atheist, I'm an agnostic, but if I was going to go to church, it would be Reverend Barber's church, because he's been able to kind of transcend that, by using, that moral language to say, this isn't left or right. It is actually between right versus wrong.
Right.
And so people who have that moral compass, who understand that, these things that we're talking about are just immoral. It's immoral that there's 140 million poor and low wealth people in the richest country in the history of the world. And so, that we don't have free universal health care, that we don't have living wages, so many of these things. And so, I don't know if that's connecting back to your original question or not, but to go, just to touch back on the Pew Research, I mean, people are not affiliating, but and so churches and denominations as an institution have something to figure out there about their own sustainability. But in terms of who people are, I mean, I think there are a lot of people who would be a progressive evangelical if they even knew that was a category that existed.
That's a thing. So many people don't even really know that. They associate it with the conservative fundamentalist movement instead of like the broad spectrum that is Christendom. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I'm Gen X, and I was a part of a thing called the Emerging Church Movement, or the Emerging Church Movement.
I'm so glad you brought that up. I wanted to point to Rob Bell. I think that was
Rob Bell.
The world that we're in now. Personally, I first noticed the shift when Rob Bell became popular during the early 2000s, and it's the reaction for and against him that kind of created a dividing line. So I'm glad that you brought that up. Please speak into the emerging church.
Well, I bring that up to say this. I'm regularly surprised when I interact with people who either A, have never heard of the emerging church movement, don't know Rob Bell or Brian McLaren or some of these other writers and thinkers, or they've heard about it and they've sort of just dismissed it, for reasons. Well, it's a bunch of white guys. I'm not going to listen to that. I'm not going to pay attention to that. Or they just don't feel like there's relevance at all to it, to them and their lives and what they're, what's happening now, which is not that much later than 10, 15 years ago when the emerging church movement was going on. And I I just kind of keep trying to kind of raise my hand and say, there have been books written on this. People have written books, and there's a lot of great resources out there. If you're rethinking your atonement theology, if you're rethinking your beliefs on LGBTQ or, whatever, like, a lot of people have done a lot of work. It's already exists. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, but it's sort of like every generation has to figure these things out for themselves. And I get that. I respect that. And at the same time, I kind of want to go, but this might help, it might help to take a look back. Because some of us, have done some work on these things already.
I do think the thing with the emerging church is really, a lot of times from what I've seen, and I wasn't involved in it, but is more about like what you do on a day-to-day basis and how it affects you, how belief affects you. I do think the difference is with millennials is they do want that social justice piece. There is I looked it up. That's the only thing I looked at before this was I remembered an article about millennials, churches that are effectively reaching millennials, and that it was in Washington, D.C. in the Washington Post. It was in 2016. It was, and that was a big piece of how they reached out to the millennial generation, because as a generation, we are outwardly focused and we want to do good in the world. We want to be proactive in changing the world and not just react to the world that we're in. We want to make a new world in a sense. So, yeah, I think that's the piece that might be missing for millennials in a lot of ways, even though the views are still there, like LGBTQ, marriage. What else? There's other like.
Well, I remember
conservative churches, they don't even have women ministers. Like even that. So,
in the 2000s, I first I mentioned Rob Bell, but I remember when millennials, our age group, were having a discussion around like over the Iraq War. Like, what do we believe about the Iraq War? Why are our conservative parents pro-war? What is that all about? Let's unpack that. Why do I automatically have to be associated with Republicans? I would say in 2004, the marriage equality issue came out. So that created a before and after moment with a lot of millennials and Christians. And then Obama, I think that was a huge dividing line there. How do we feel about Obama?
Yeah, he's always said he's a Christian, and I still to this day don't understand the reaction to Obama from the evangelical movement or fundamentalist evangelical movement, that why they didn't like him and why like they would call him the Antichrist, and that did really turn me off. I was already kind of veering that way with the war and the torture. Like torture was a big debate under Bush. Like, should we be torturing people? Right. And a lot of Christians were like, yeah. A lot of the older Christians were like, yeah, we gotta torture people, of course. How are we gonna get information? And I'm thinking, no, I don't think we need to do that. So and then whenever Obama became president, it's like they went right and we went left, and there's this hole in the middle.
I felt like millennials were following a narrative of left economics.
Holistically or collectively.
And we started to get like around the Occupy Wall Street movement. That's when we started to awaken to some of those ideas. The Moral Mondays, William Barber, and like basically progressive Christianity, like you said, the return of progressive Christianity.
Yeah. So I'll confess that I am someone who voted not once but twice for George W. Bush. After 9/11, it was while I had great reservations, I was not inspired by Al Gore. Or was it John Kerry? I can't remember.
John Kerry was
2004. It was John Kerry.
Neither. I didn't feel anything for them as candidates. And by 2004, post 9/11, the prevailing sort of thought in my mind was, you don't switch horses midstream. We're in the middle of all these wars, and we've got to have steady leadership.
I'm familiar with that.
And so, that was my thinking then. By 2007,
Right.
after hearing Obama speak at the Democratic National Convention, I was like, this guy.
Right.
And I was all in from the beginning of his candidacy. I did interviews with the Washington Times newspaper as an evangelical who supports Obama. And I was very, very vocal and very engaged and very out front. And as you said, Ryan, it sort of became this dividing line. I think we can see now.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly didn't. I knew that there was like political tension. This polarization was just getting worse and worse.
Mm-hmm.
But it didn't. I didn't understand. Right. I just, as a white person, I really didn't understand all of the depth of the racial
animosity
mm-hmm. that were going on there. I don't think a lot of white evangelicals even still really understand it. They just didn't, they
didn't want the mark of the beast. They didn't want the beast.
and then
he's going to bring something. He's going to be different. I'm not sure why. He's different.
and the right certainly did a good job with the whole Jeremiah Wright thing and demonizing him, and to the point where Obama had to, just sort of disassociate himself from his pastor for however many years.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know Jeremiah Wright at that point, but I've certainly gotten to know him and absolutely respect him greatly today. My gosh, Obama was not pro-gay marriage when he first got elected. He had to evolve on that issue, in order to get elected. There were a lot of things that have happened since he was president, or over his 8 years as president. But yeah, that was a huge. I agree, that was a huge dividing line. Reverend Barber talks about the call and response in American history, as there's 8 years of progress under a black president. Now we've seen the backlash, or the white lash that Van Jones called it, with the Trump presidency. Anyway.
Yeah, I tend to think that I'm glad you said call and response, because I see the response of Obama as, as at that time the furthest swing of the pendulum. But I feel like that pendulum was very much in motion during the 90s under Clinton. I mean, I remember growing up, and there was, my parents still express like a bodily hatred for the Clintons. It's the closest my parents come to swearing. Is when they come up, and the way that, and I've heard my parents actually express this recently, which is they see what they would call a moral degradation that began, they would use the word sort of began, they probably put it back to like the taking prayer out of schools, but that sort of began under the Clintons in some kind of accelerated manner after, and it was specifically around issues like abortion and this sort of thing, and that the percolation of gay rights, abortion and gay rights are a huge deal in the evangelical community, because they're like these invisible moral boundaries where if society crosses them, then you kind of incur the wrath of God. You lose the blessing of God because you're engaging in murder, and you're engaging in a kind of sexual abomination, and you're condoning it on a grand scale. And so they see that, the way that I experienced it was they saw that percolating under the Clintons. And then we had George W. Bush, and the war was bad, but, it was also kind of protecting the innocents. And and so there was just enough sort of Old Testament theologizing around some of that stuff that they could kind of hang on to it. But he still was basically, he put in Roberts, and he didn't want to do stem cells. And so on these issues, it's a really big deal. And then I think that, here's my take on it, is that Obama sort of just happened to be at the intersection of a lot of latent animosities. He has the word Hussein in his name. So you have this Islamophobia coming after 9/11, yes, he is black. And so the white hegemony and some of the meritocratic quote unquote critiques of, you know, Black culture that a lot of white culture have, that suddenly that's being really challenged by the ascendancy of a Black man. And I also think that it's quite unforgivable for a lot of conservative evangelicals that the LGBT movement percolated and blossomed under Obama. And the fact that, you know, the Supreme Court made it okay during that era. That's how I often hear evangelicals talk about that trajectory. I think Obama was in the chair when that stuff happened, and so in that sense, he was he brought in more openness to Muslims in their mind. He brought in, you know, the using their words, the sort of, you know, transgressive sexual behavior, and he was so beloved and in sync with the values of the media that all of this is just the globalist cabal, you know, having its heyday. And so so anyway, that's sort of my take on, like, I think Obama was our last Democratic president. He was progressive, and he, in some ways, you know, he was also centrist in other ways. But I think that there's a lot of theology that was sort of present that could label him as a wolf in sheep's clothing, because he was basically on the wrong side of, you know, at least three key things. You know, having a sort of Muslim narrative swirling around him somehow, sort of and then race is sort of mixed up into that. He's pro-choice, and he is the king while gay marriage becomes okay. And that's how I experience, you know, the dividing line of Obama. I definitely see it as a pendulum swing. And I think that you could tell me guys what you think about this, that some of us younger folks, it was in the exaggerated rancor. It wasn't exaggerated, it was actual. But it was in the sort of the fervency of the anti-Obama movement reached like a new peak. The evangelicals seemed to have a new volume level. It was a lot of the same issues, but that it reached a sort of a new pitch. And that pitch was alarming to us. It was alarming to me, because when you would just look at the man and see what he's saying and see what he actually does, that it didn't align, unless you really held those very conservative positions. It didn't align with the level of rancor. But the level of rancor, I hope I've done a good job of describing why the rancor reached a fever pitch then, if that computes to you guys.
So
no, it definitely does. Yeah.
We haven't brought this word up yet, but I think it's important. It's the culture war. Evangelicals and fundamentalists, they see themselves as in this culture war for the soul of America. And I always brought up biblically that, like, Paul the apostle, it's not his business whether a non-believer does this or that or the other thing. It matters what happens within the church. But I think that fever pitch came because they sensed that they were losing this culture war, and that's why they aligned themselves with Donald Trump. What was their big argument was that justified, even though he was very immoral, that he was going to appoint
the conservative judges. Yeah, I wanted to bring that up when we had mentioned earlier about if he was co-opting evangelicals, but on the other hand, it sounds like in some sense the evangelicals are happy to be trying to co-opt him, because they're getting what they want too. They want those conservative judges in there, and so it seems like they both made a pact with each other that they seem to be pretty happy with, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, I actually think that the Bushes were not evangelical enough. They were not evangelical enough for the religious right. And so they didn't wield their power in a way that the religious right really wanted. And so the transactional, down to his bones Donald Trump, even my take on it, he was like, I just have to do these things and I get these votes. And, you know, there's a blurriness between where his sincerity might be and how much of that he actually believes and stuff like that. But man, it's definitely working for him. And he has vote lock because he checks those boxes. He's willing to check the transgender movement. He's willing to check, he's willing to say things that have racial and Islamic resentment underneath them, and he's willing to, he is willing to. Gosh, what was that other thing? Yeah, the abortion, judges overturn Roe v. Wade.
Yeah, I appreciate the history that you just gave, Dan, because I didn't mean to oversimplify, sort of the Obama backlash.
No, you didn't.
I think you touched on a lot more of the nuance there. I'm just going to throw out a bunch of things that have just been bouncing in my head as we've been having this conversation, because I think a lot of the things we're talking about, at least for me, I certainly wasn't as deeply aware of the torture program that was going on post 9/11 that we are aware of now. So The Report, that film, what was really going on during the George W. Bush administration, the movie Vice, if you haven't seen that, my gosh, that really focuses on all of the stuff that Dick Cheney was doing, how he was really in charge and running the show during those 8 years. There's a great, the documentary, The Family, right? Talking about the religious right and what they've been working on in DC with to gain political power for so many years. That's incredible. People need to watch that.
It's on Netflix, right? Correct? The Family on Netflix? Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, The Report is on Amazon and The Family on Netflix.
Talk about secret society.
Yeah. There's a book you were just talking about on the sort of the dog whistle messaging, the racial dog whistle messaging of Trump. Great book by Ian Haney Lopez that came out about that. I'm blanking on the title of it because I don't like the title of the book. But look up Ian Haney Lopez.
You could also send me the link and I'll post it in the comments.
Yeah. Merge Left is the title of the book. Yeah. Okay. Merge Left. But he gives data. He's got the receipts on both progressive political messaging that works, that I'll just say that works, and also what Trump is really doing with the really not even so subtle dog whistle messaging. I'll just say this.
Like an actual
his argument is that his dog whistle messaging is actually not for his base. It's actually for all of us, the liberal progressives, to react to. And when we react to it, he then pivots and goes, well, either he acts like he's the victim, or look at them, they hate all of you.
And look how crazy they are. Look how riled up they get. Yeah.
Exactly, and they're not criticizing me; they're criticizing you guys. They're making fun of you, and that's how he's using that. But the other thing will this
feed into persecution and maybe some end time theology and
absolutely. I think that's the thing that has come out. Gerardo Marti at Davidson College has I think he's got a book out. Talking about the data that's come out since the 2016 election, how evangelicals really do have this persecution complex, that they feel like, I'm not making this up. They feel more persecuted than the Black community, than the Muslim community. White evangelicals feel like they are, quote unquote, have been under attack. That culture war language, they have believed it, and they feel like they're the ones who are, they're losing because they are losing. They're losing hegemony in the culture.
That's right.
As the culture embraces marriage equality, defends the right, a woman's right to choose. These things as things are becoming more progressive culturally, and at the same time, even evangelical churches are seeing people leave and churches are shrinking. It's not just the main line that's been shrinking over these years. Southern Baptist churches, evangelical churches have been declining as well. So there is a real, and then the racial piece. White people will still be the majority, in terms of one racial group, but we will be a minority majority country very soon. And it's that as that tips the scales, white people, white evangelicals are feeling like, you know, they're losing control and they're losing position, which is why Trump has been such a godsend for them. They're really having a moment. But the last thing I wanted to mention, it's not out yet, but there's a new documentary that is coming out. The working title of it was Pro-Lifetime. But I don't know that that's going to be the final title of it, but if you Google that, if you search for that, I'm really hoping it's supposed to come out before November, before the presidential election. It is all about how, essentially, how the right-wing religious right has so effectively used the abortion issue. It's specifically about the abortion issue, but it's really kind of getting behind the scenes and trying to educate people on the history of it and how it's been leveraged and used to really manipulate people for their votes. And I'll just say this for me personally, that was a huge reason for me moving away from, I was raised to be a good, you know, white evangelical Republican my entire life. And when I saw the emphasis on the abortion issue, and then I saw how Republican politicians didn't really seem to care about that. When they had power, they didn't really seem to do anything about that issue. It really just was like, okay, you're just talking about this to rile people up and get their votes. You're not actually doing anything. That was a big part of my disillusionment and what pushed me away and led me in another direction, you know, sort of politically. But
we're talking about what the Christian left or the progressive Christians are reacting to. We know what we're countering. What are progressive Christians for? What is the world that they want to bring in?
Yeah. Well, I want to come back to this issue of social justice, because that's certainly been a big part of our work through Transform Network over the last 10 years. And really from the beginning, when we started the network, although we were focused on church and helping people do experimental forms of church, what we called emerging church or missional church, there was always a real emphasis and focus on justice, and because it really felt like that had been lacking in so many, so much of our experience of what church was about. And yet those of us who helped to start the network felt like that's such an important and necessary piece. And so we do a lot of work around that, because I absolutely agree. I mean, I think this is where mainline churches and evangelical churches continue to fail, and how people are continuing to be disillusioned and leaving, because they see churches might be engaged in some forms of charity, food pantries and clothing closets, and a lot of this kind of thing that there's a place for it, and it's certainly needed. It's not justice. And justice is about going to the root of these issues. To use the old analogy, it's not just pulling the babies out of the river, it's going upstream to figure out who's throwing babies in the river in the first place. It's stopping it, and that's justice. And our churches, when our churches, I was just in a church meeting not that long ago about, should we allow this homeless person to, live in their car in our parking lot? And as if that was like a security concern more than a love your neighbor concern. So it's those kinds of things that people look at churches and go, what are you doing? This is ridiculous. This is not even my understanding of the gospel. This is not even a hard question. So
can the Christian left and right come together during this pandemic?
What would they be coming together over?
Yeah.
What can anybody come together over?
I was just going to say no.
Yeah.
They're not. There's,
I mean, you would think a major crisis involving health, something that doesn't really speak to the identity war. I mean, any corona could go after anyone, regardless of your gender, orientation, class. You would think that that would be at least one issue that we could all come together on
Yeah,
and not play the leprosy game.
it has been really disappointing to me, and I'm of course I want to, I may be getting an exaggerated version of this through the sources that I'm reading. I just confess that, but like that there does seem to be this really bizarre thing where like the right is the Christian right seems to be on the side of the economy, and the Christian left seems to be on the side of like people not dying. And I know that's a drastic oversimplification in some ways, but I feel like that there's something about that has been deeply troubling. That is one of the things that maybe the Obama and the Trump era in particular, has sort of revealed about the religious right movement per se, which is how thoroughly Republican it is. That it's hard to put for me to put religious words to the drive to open up the economy before it would kill people. Like it starts to beg the question, well, what's religious about that stance? It doesn't seem to be religious. It seems to be business centric, and so, it's one would think that the Christians would be able to come together over the raw saving of lives. And I've been quite dismayed and don't have a great explanation other than, a kind of a finger pointing one, that that polarization and that Faustian bargain with Trumpism has produced a quote religious right that seems more right than religious.
I was thinking of the proof text that they would say is they would use, I think, is Paul to Timothy, where they'd say, "He who does not work does not eat," where Paul was talking about a certain context there. But yeah, it's more about finding in their religion something to support what they already think.
Yeah, you're backing into the scripture at that point.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right.
It's such a good question, and I'm as I've been sitting here thinking, I'm like, it seems like there should be something we can come together on around this, but we're living in such different worlds of facts and information now. Rachel Maddow had this quote, it used to be that we, agreed on the facts and we disagreed on what to do about it. And now we can't even agree on the facts. Our different polarized groups have their own facts. And so you can't agree on the facts. It's really hard to come together and agree on any kind of courses of action or solutions.
Well said.
Well, the Bible says in the last days, it will be like the days of Noah, where everybody pretty much does what's right in their own eyes. So just to work in some scripture.
I saw on your website, your nonprofit site, that you do teach other churches about how to reach out via social media. And just on the point of like what's going on in June with having the, the Poor People's Campaign. I mean, my friends, religious and also people who I do know are atheists, they were planning on showing up in person for that. And as far as I know, they're still going to do that. So what has your experience been helping churches out with their outreach in that respect?
Well, I mean, it's such an interesting time right now because of the stay-in-place orders. Churches have had to figure out, even the churches that before this weren't really doing anything have had to figure out how do we move things online to be able to continue gathering through Zoom, video conferences and things like that. And it'll be interesting to see after, once we, get through this, how churches continue to evolve and embrace technology in different ways. So I think it's, I think in a lot of ways churches are being finally forced to do something they probably should have done a long time ago in terms of embracing social media and different forms of technology to engage people and, just and yet at the same time, there's a lot of churches that are probably not, or are just going to let this go as soon as they figure out that they can, meet in person once again. It's crucial for faith communities to be engaged and present in online and in social media, on these different platforms and in these different communities, not just from a marketing standpoint, but from a community engagement place. I had a conversation the other day about, when I was working for the Evangelical Mission Organization, sort of a theology of communication that I developed just for myself, my own sense of purpose and mission, if you will, in doing the work that I was doing in terms of communications and media. And I called it kingdom journalism. This idea of that I got from Acts chapter 2, verse 11, in the story of Pentecost, where it talks about all of these people were gathered of different ethnicities who spoke different languages, but it says they could understand each other's languages, and they were describing the mighty deeds of God. And it was that phrase, the mighty deeds of God, or describing the mighty deeds of God, that I really latched onto as sort of like this just this hinge point for me in my thinking about that. And then I went back, and you can go throughout Scripture. This idea of the mighty deeds of God is refrained over and over and over again. That communication is not the thing that I challenged myself and would challenge others to think about, engaging in with this technology and through these platforms. It's not about self-promotion or, marketing your church so much as it is describing the mighty deeds of God and really engaging, listening, and and interacting, having a dialogue with the people who are out there, who are part of your community. What are their needs? How can how can your faith community meet those needs? And lifting up those stories. And it's not really how great your worship is or how great the preaching is, although I love those things, and those things are great. Ultimately, those are not the things that the majority of the people out there it's going to change their lives, to be honest.
When you say the mighty deeds of God, do you mean that in a Christian left framing, that the mighty deeds of God is essentially like a moral, moral social manifestation of godly values in the lives of things like justice, in the areas of things like justice and people being brought back to peace and being made well and that sort of thing? Because I have enough history with the conservative movement to know that what they would tend to think of the mighty deeds of God would be, if you're charismatic, would be this sort of like, supernatural, metaphysical manifestations of sort of God's power, like mass healings or something like this. And another mighty deed of God would be like mass conversions. And so they're much more, they're supernatural, and in some senses, these sort of theocratic, manifestations. But it sounds like when you're talking about the mighty deeds of God, what you're talking about are things on the heart level and things on, on a sort of interpersonal, social level.
Kingdom building.
Yeah, kingdom. Even that phrase, if kingdom building to the right is different than. So I guess this is what I want to say is an invitation to talk to me, like make specific what you mean by the mighty deeds of God. In terms from a Christian left perspective.
Yeah, you're hearing me absolutely right. I mean, in my theology, in the place where I am today, as a progressive evangelical, for me, the mighty deeds of God is very much about that moral arc of the universe bending towards justice, and those stories that point to that narrative of what God is doing in the world. and how we can, how we can be part of what God is already doing. That is very much for me what I am talking about, what I'm thinking about when I talk about the mighty deeds of God. And you're right. I mean, it's a theological idea that someone from that conservative fundamentalist place would have a very different definition of.
Do you think that the Christian left is more in step with culture in general, and that sense of invitation would be sort of more attractive than the more theocratic and kind of, supernatural, version, and that in that sense that the church should be more, and I hate to use this word, should be more attractive on those levels, not because of great worship, not because of whatever, but because what people are looking for, in a sense, is they're looking for God in that way. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes me think of some language that we used in the emerging church movement, and I'm reaching for the terminology, but it's essentially the idea of open systems versus closed systems. And I think the progressive church is much more of an open system. It's about who's included, and conservative church is a closed system. It's about who's excluded, right? Who's not a part of our group. And so I do think a more inclusive, I think inclusive is a great word. If people are hung up on liberal or progressive or some of that other politicized language. Yeah, I mean, inclusivity is a hallmark of progressive faith. And I think that's ultimately a good thing.
Well, just elaborate on, and in that sense, do you feel like it's a little more in line with the arc of those things in culture, that in a sense that the Christian left might be, better positioned to introduce people to ideas of faith than the Christian right per se, because they, in that sense, the Christian left they are in step with what in a lot of ways mainstream culture has sort of been going along these areas, more emphasis on social justice and criminal justice and that sort of thing. Does that feel right to you, that if properly articulated, that in a sense the church would sort of come back? I don't want to push too hard on this, but
yeah,
I'd really love to know your thoughts on
it. My answer is a qualified yes, and my qualifier is this: the institutions that are sort of holding progressive Christianity right now are in large part these mainline denominational institutions that have not themselves evolved culturally, structurally, and so there's still a big challenge there. I feel like the evangelical church is more in touch culturally in terms of presentation, aesthetics, and packaging, and aesthetics. Yeah. And because it's been able to evolve in ways that the mainline, denominational churches have not. But the theology of the mainline denominational churches is very much, I think, would be appealing to a lot of people. It just comes in this shitty packaging.
Yeah, the mainline churches, if you go to them, they're very traditional. They seem very traditional. And if you go to an evangelical church, it's like a concert. So, but it's almost like they're trying to balance themselves out by the progressive theology wants to hold on to some of the more traditional types of services, and whereas the evangelicals will they want to hold on to the more orthodox theology, even though their service is so modern.
Right, good point.
And as critical as I am of the elevation church type, model, I think they've been pretty successful at sort of taking a don't ask, don't tell, approach to gay, inclusion. Well, we're just not going to answer that question. Everybody's welcome. And we're just not going to, talk about it. And so they've been able, those kind of churches sort of sidestep those things, but just try not to talk about them and make them issues.
So you mentioned sidestep. What, with millennials and Gen Xers, what are the issues you think we will not be pushed aside? What are the core values?
Great question.
That will become the new conservatism?
Oh gosh, the new conservatism. I mean, I don't see.
Or fundamentalism.
Yeah, insofar as today's progressives are tomorrow's
conservatives.
Yeah. What are the new what are the fundamentals of tomorrow?
Oh, got you. I see what you're doing. You're flipping that language on the side.
We're older. We're going to have things that are non-negotiable. What are those going to be?
Mm-hmm.
Wow. So this is something that honestly I have to challenge in the progressive world a lot. I forget where I got this language from. Reverend Alexia Salvatierra is one mentor of ours. I think she's probably the one where I heard it from first. And this is the idea of correct line thinking. And I think I do think the liberal left certainly has this. I can point to some very salient examples that are going on right now. I won't get into them, but where you see a similar thing happening on the left that happens on the right all the time, in terms of we've all got to line up, let's say, behind this particular political candidate, and we'll just ignore any criticism or potential issue, and try to silence any critics, so that so this idea of correct line thinking, and my gosh, if you question Uncle Joe, then you're out. That happens on the left as well, and that's why I really consider myself a progressive. That we don't have to get into neoliberalism, but I think a lot of people
will get into that in a particular episode. We're gonna just have to have an episode focused on neoliberalism.
Yeah, that would be good. But
we'll invite you back for that.
Well, that would be great. I would love to be a part of that. So that's where I go. And when you ask me that question, I'm like, I don't really think I want to come up with that set of progressive fundamentals. There are hallmarks, or there are sort of, Roger Wolsey wrote a book called Kissing Fish, where he kind of talks about some sort of hallmarks of what progressive Christianity are. I think Eric Elnes wrote a book. He's a UCC minister. I forget the title of his book, but there's some different people who have certainly made attempps at sort of, and of course these are all white guys that I'm naming now, which is why I definitely want to bring in sort of Black liberation theology and prophetic voices as well, because
we're going to have a part 2 of this. We haven't even touched on kissing, dating, goodbye.
That's right.
I could hashtag sex and we'll get more viewers.
I know. We brought up DC Talk earlier, and we haven't even talked about them.
Okay. So. This is part 1, isn't it?
Sounds good. Well, this has been fun. I've really enjoyed
getting to hang out with
you guys. I really appreciate the invitation.
Thank you.
Thank you.